everybody. Welcome to this episode. I've got an incredible interview for you today with Stanley Cohen. I just wanted to make a brief note, which is that this episode was filmed before October 7th. So the events of October 7th hadn't happened yet, which is why they are not at all addressed in the video, although I am speaking to a lawyer who represented Hamas. With that being said, I hope you enjoy the interview. I'm very excited to be speaking with Stanley Cohen, who is a lawyer and an activist. Stanley has been called a Nazi and a self-loathing Jew. The New York Times has called him a freewheeling radical lawyer. And I believe Alan Dershowitz called you a horrible human being, which I think we should probably take as a compliment coming from him. But Stanley has represented accused terrorists, including members of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda, as well as Osama bin Laden's son-in-law. He has said that he represents the despaired, the despised, and the disenfranchised. In 2015, he served 11 months in prison for tax violations, which he considers an attempt to silence him in a witch hunt by the U.S. government. Chris Hedges wrote about this incident that Cohen has furiously battled back against the excesses of state power for 25 years, and that punishing him for defending the unpopular is a complete farce. And Mr. Cohen has said, "I am a target till the day I die because of what I say, who I represent, and what I write." So, first of all, Stanley, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for the invitation. My pleasure. You do great work, and I'm glad I could add to its body.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really excited to get to hear you, Stanley, talk about some of the principles that have guided you through all of this, and also your experiences with not only defending the unpopular, but also being, unpopular with the U.S. government.
And other governments.
And okay, there you go. Yeah, so I believe you've been banned from Israel and Egypt. Is that correct?
Also now Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I also was indicted for seditious conspiracy in 1990 by Canada for my participation as the attorney for the Mohawk Warrior Society during the standoff at Oka, with the case finally dismissed when the Canadian government, when the light went on in the judge's head one day while I was arguing on my own behalf in Montreal, and said, "Judge, I'm a little bit confused on, I've handled seditious conspiracy cases in the United States. The threshold requirement for seditious conspiracy is I have to be a citizen of the state I'm conspiring to overthrow. I'm not a citizen of Canada." The judge sort of looked at the federal prosecutor from the Canadian government and said, "Why don't you two go walk during lunch and see if you can resolve this?" So we came back and the Canadian prosecutor said, "Case dismissed."
Interesting.
I've been robbed in a few places. And I've been arrested a total of, I think, 6 times in my life. Twice in my former life as a human being, when I was a social worker or organizer before I became a lawyer, and I think 4 times since becoming a lawyer.
So you've definitely had to deal with quite a lot of authority trying to come after you for the work you do and for representing the less powerful people who need a voice. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of the moral underpinning of that? What drove you to get into fighting for these causes that can bring so much trouble upon your head?
I grew up in a very different time, in a very different place, in a very different world. I was an anti-war activist in Vietnam by the time I was 15 or 16. I think my first arrest in anti-war activism against Vietnam was when I was 16. I grew up in a very different time and place where going to class was less important than fighting the state. I was engaged extensively in anti-war activities as a very young man, still in my teens. I was targeted by the FBI and accused of being involved while living in Brooklyn with firebombing Marine recruiting stations. I guess the statute of limitations has run. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't, who knows. I also was a suspect in the firebombing or the arson of the Whitehall Street depository for 1 million records for Vietnam, for draftees. Again, they targeted me. It went nowhere. I went from a community organizer and anti-war activist to, after I got my undergraduate degree and having been thrown out of 2 universities for my politics, finally went to the third, got my degree, and then went into VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, where I lived and worked with the Winnebago, Omaha, and Santee Sioux Indian Nations in Nebraska and South Dakota, not far from Wounded Knee, where I helped to set up a legal services project. When that was done, I returned to the East Coast, continued my community organizing, was the head of a street drug program for largely dropouts and homeless women and men, young women and men of color. Then ended up the number 2 or 3 person in the largest anti-poverty agency in the East Coast, headed by a gentleman named Leslie Roberts, who was one of Martin Luther King's top advisors, dear friends with Ossie Davis and Moby D, both of whom I met through him. He was the president of 1199 at one point, the vice president and then president of District 65 UAW, was head of the national union effort to boycott South Africa. So this was my boss for 5 years. And one day, he called me into his office and said, "You're fired." And I considered him my godfather. He considered me his godson. He said, "You're a great organizer. You're doing tremendous work, but you need to go to law school." I was already almost 30 years of age. He said, "You've hit your cap with what you do. We need lawyers like you. You're fired. Go to law school." So I went to law school, and we fought over it for a while. And while in law school, was privileged to very early get involved in trial work with, among others, Chokwe Lumumba Sr., whose son is the mayor of Jacksonville, and representing Sekou Odinga and other BLA members. I myself, while in law school, was subpoenaed by the United States government doing an investigation about the Black Liberation Army because 2 members who had been arrested worked with and for me at the Anti-Poverty Agency, and they clad leads and claimed that I was somehow involved in it. And then there was the Brinks robbery that I ultimately became involved in as a defense attorney. So I spent 6 or 7 years with legal aid. It came time they offered me a promotion. I figured if you're offering me a promotion, it's time for me to move on. I don't need to be a supervisor. Went into private practice, essentially with Lynn Stewart, who along with Bill Kunstler and I represented successfully the actual cop shooter Larry Davis in the South Bronx, successfully, and on multiple murder cases. And from there, my practice exploded, and in more ways than one, and became actively involved for years as a lawyer for the Tompkins Square Park movement, the squatter movement on the Lower East Side. Was the lawyer that in the movie and play Rent, there's that classic line where the police are moving to put out the fire barrels. And one of the homeless organizers says, "Get lawyer man on the phone, get lawyer man on the phone." And that was me. And I got an injunction from so-called Cut 'em Loose Bruce at 3:00 in the middle of the night to get it stopped, and it was stopped. Did years of later represented the 13th Street squatter case, which we won and then lost on appeal, which was a group of homeless and shelter dropouts that had spent 10 years renovating squats on the 13th Street, with the city then moved to evict them. Along the line, I became involved with doing a lot of work in Akwesasne and represented the Mohawk Warrior Society in armed standoffs at Oka and armed standoffs in Akwesasne, in an incident where a helicopter was shot down over the territory in Ganyonge. I still represent a lot of Mohawks. My partner of 27 years is a Mohawk woman who is an artist, famous artist. And along the way, I represented Abu Marzouk, the leader of the founder, one of the leaders of the leader of the political wing of Hamas, successfully. Represented at other times members of the IRA, members of Hezbollah, Al-Manar, the network, Shining Path, ACT UP represented successfully the PayPal 14 in Northern California. I am currently representing a lead defendant in the domestic terrorism RICO charges in Cop City in Georgia. Have challenged and fought Israel twice in the AU. I have sued Egypt in the AU. I challenged Russia in the FSB and Interpol last year and prevailed. Got a red notice vacated on a Chechnyan client of mine wanted for terrorism, so-called terrorism, and his files purged. And Putin's not very happy because it basically set a precedent in Interpol that said whenever Putin goes to Interpol for what he considers to be terrorists, you have to take a close look because there's now an established record that he and the FSB use torture and worse, including execution, against those they are at odds with politically or on a faith-based basis. So what can I say? I've been doing this stuff, whether as a 16-year-old student activist or as an organizer, as a drug program director, as a defense attorney for more than half a century now. And we'll do this until the creator says it's time to move on. And that's pretty much the story. So I think the one unifying factor is I have always struggled against the state, domestic and foreign. I have never felt obedient to a given flag or an anthem or an oath or a faith. I believe very strongly in the international collective struggle. I believe in the necessity of challenging power, no matter what it may bring to you, your own life, and it has in my case more than once.
And about that aspect of everything. So when did the U.S. government first start to come after you? Clearly you've angered, a lot of people throughout your career, a lot of powerful people, governments, but talking about ours specifically, when did they first start?
Well, it first began in law school when I was issued the grand jury subpoena investigating the BLA. And the judge, a famous civil rights judge, a civil rights lawyer who became a judge, granted the motion to quash and gratuitously said, those that are going to fight against you after you get out of law school are going to have a tough fight, Mr. Cohen. The real battle...
What is the BLA? I'm sorry to interrupt.
The Black Liberation Army, which was a spin-off of the Black Panther movement, which eventually merged with the Weather Underground and was involved allegedly in numerous... they were prime targets of COINTELPRO, which was the FBI plan to assassinate members of the Black Liberation Army, the BLA, the Black Panthers, the American Indian movement, the Young Lords, to set people up, to wrongfully prosecute them. They tried to blackmail Martin Luther King. So I was originally, as early as 1980 or 81, targeted by them. They tried to put pressure on me to get information. And it went on to various stages. I guess the next time I had a real big full-on battle with them was over with struggles with the Mohawks, where I was on more than one occasion threatened by federal prosecutors and law enforcement, and federal officers were being prosecuted for conspiracy because they accused me of crossing the line as an attorney. And I was involved with the various armed struggles. It was all nonsense. They didn't want friction. They didn't want an informed lawyer. And I was threatened with prosecution. It never happened at that point. Where it really exploded was when I represented Abu Marzouk from 1993 to 1995. And this was just in the days before and after Hamas became a foreign designated terrorist organization, or an FTO in the United States. We did fundraisers because we had to bring experts in, and for my fee, which was not much at all at that point. And the government insisted if we were going to do fundraisers that we had to identify who was donating to the defense and how much they were donating. And we agreed to a deal where a civil branch of the Department of Justice would have a list to make sure they were not part of the FTOs, but it would not be shared with the Criminal Defense Division. a year or so later, after the end of Abu Marzouk, we began to see an increase in prosecutions of Palestinians. And lo and behold, there were allegations and arrest complaints and warrants and in indictments that they had contributed to his defense, that they had done things on behalf of his defense. So the Department of Justice had broken the rule, had crossed the line, and this wall that had been set up by civil had been breached, and information was provided to criminal, which was being used against clients of mine. So I made a decision at that point that I would do two things, since I was so heavily involved with the Palestinian resistance movement domestically and internationally. I would no longer charge Palestinian clients fees for any cases, because in order to represent them, if you were charging fees, you had to get what was called an OFAC license, an Office of Financial Asset Control license, which is registering with the government when you're being paid by groups or individuals that are designated as terrorists. That includes states, that includes movements, it includes individuals. And I just decided I wasn't going to collect fees. And because there's an FTO list, I exercised due diligence, and we had people that voluntarily contributed to expenses, to travel, to hotels, for experts. And because I did my due diligence and checked the list and saw none of them were on the list, I said, fuck you. I don't need a license to do this work. And I had a screaming match with a lawyer for OFAC who insisted that I had to get an OFAC license to represent FTOs. And I said, I do not. I only have to get an OFAC license if I'm getting paid by them or people that represent them or work with them or support them. And I'm telling you, that doesn't apply. I'm doing my due diligence. And he said, well, then we're going to indict you. So I said, fuck you, indict me. Do what you have to do. So that set in motion for a number of years harassment from the government, where I learned they would question clients of mine, particularly Palestinian clients and Mohawk clients, ask for dirt about me. It was very clear who they were targeting. And literally within 6 hours of 9/11, the FBI had reached out to tribal police in Akwesasne and had asked them to approach my partner to get information about if she was aware of me saying anything or being involved in any way or knowing anything about this. So they came to her house on the res at that point. We were commuting back and forth, and tribal police reached out to a friend of hers who was a lawyer to go and see her. And as soon as they said, well, we want to talk about Stanley, she slammed the door in their face. So that set in motion a whole period of about 10 solid years, where I kept hearing that clients were being questioned, clients were being offered deals if they rolled over on me, where people were asked questions whether they were in the Middle East, whether they were Mohawk, whether they were in the United States, about me, my politics, my efforts, whether I was being an ethical lawyer. The federal prosecutor in a federal courtroom, where he said, I should have fucking indicted you on the Indian tax case. He ended up being the prosecutor that indicted me years later on impeding the IRS, not tax evasion, but impeding the IRS, which had not been brought in the Eastern District, in the Northern District of New York, let alone the New York or the East Coast, for over 30 years. That
so he had a personal
the material support investigation died. Mm-hmm. And then I heard they picked up an investigation about me because one of my former clients had said, oh, I was a conduit between him and another client in a pot conspiracy, moving pot from the res to New York City. So this federal prosecutor, who had said I should have fucking indicted you years before, went to see my former client in New York City, brought him an attorney, and started questioning him about the allegation of me being a linchpin in a marijuana conspiracy, which, by the way, they believed Trump had made notice about this, that somehow I'd connected tax-exempt cigarettes with Hamas. Funny thing is, they started questioning him about this, and then he started laughing, my client. And they said to him, well, what's so funny? And he said, well, you're alleging that Stanley was providing marijuana to me in Queens for distribution in New York City. When was that to occur? They gave him the period of time. And he laughed. And they said, what's so funny? And he said, well, you should have done your homework. I was in federal prison then. A freak show for a year, or a year and a half. They went judge shopping and found the judge to oversee the case who hated me, a federal judge who hated me. a federal judge who just 6 months before I had attacked on an appeal and accused of ethical misconduct in front of the Second Circuit. So he was not very happy. A federal judge who, in a conflict of interest hearing, I ended up cross-examining his best friend from high school, college, and the DA's office, and he admitted that the judge was aware of certain activities he was engaged. So it was a shit show. The government grabbed him. So he oversees the case. It now reaches the point where in year 14, 15 of the investigation, they're threatening to subpoena and bring into a trial in front of this judge my partner, my partner's family, other people of Makwasasni. They're trying to cut deals with clients. So basically their purpose here was to destroy my practice, destroy my family. I'm going to cross-examine my partner on a witness stand who had been abused as a young person by another witness in the case. So I just decided, fuck this, we're ending this. We're getting it over, and I instructed my lawyer because ultimately their purpose was to take my license, take it away permanently, silence my voice, and move on. And so we agreed to impeding the IRS, which basically says I screwed with the IRS. And 2 counts in another. Then they charged me in the Southern District of New York with failing to file final tax returns in 2 years. So we took the disposition. We moved on. I ended up doing actually 10 months in a prison camp where I taught other inmates, many of whom had been doing 20 and 30-year sentences, on how to do research for federal appeals and how to navigate FOIA. I was the law librarian. Came out, and my license, which had been suspended upon the time that I entered the prison, was eventually reinstated, nunc-pro-tunc, back to the time that I entered the prison, between prison and supervised release for a year. So it was suspended for 2.5 years, but it actually was a 6-month suspension from the time everything was done. And all of this is now about a decade old. And I still periodically hear from clients in the United States and overseas that agents are asking questions about me, about my politics, and about the work that I'm doing, and am I doing anything wrong or inappropriate. I'm still involved with battles over with the IRS, who last year accused me of doing something wrong or illegal even. And it was absolute bullshit. And then the agent got off his ass and took a look and said, oops, we're sorry, we were wrong. So, I mean, this is going on. Is it going to go away? No. Am I going to change what I've been doing for half a century? No.
So you've clearly got a sense of humor, first of all, about all these things, and a defiant attitude. But I do have to wonder, how does it affect you to be targeted in this way? Does it, I mean, clearly it never stopped your morale. It never made you want to change course. But I wonder, what has it been like for you? What has it been like to have your family harassed, to have them constantly scrutinizing you, to feel that surveillance, and then, you know, not even getting to the prison sentence, which I do want to ask you as well about that experience. But what has it been like just to have that level of scrutiny and that witch hunt kind of hanging over you?
You know, I've said since I guess it was my godfather, who I spoke about, the trade union organizer who fired me and forced me to go to law school, who said to me as a young man, never gauge your success by those that love you, but rather by those that hate you. Look, when you challenge a state, when you become friction under the machine, when you become a successful adversary, when you're not intimidated by the kinds of things that intimidate, unfortunately, many people, they come for you. It comes with the turf. Yes, the time that was most difficult and has been most difficult is the pain that it caused to my family, the discomfort and the problems. But I have a very, very strong family. My partner's family is very, very strong, and they understand the Mohawk people are very strong. They are used to exploitation and attacks and assaults. I was adopted by the Bear Clan. But on the other side of my natural family, my great-grandmother was an anti-Zionist activist in Lithuania, Latvia, and Russia. My grandfather and his brother were Narodniks. That was a political group that fought the Tsar and engaged in armed struggle against them. At an early age, they were put on a boat by my great-grandmother and sent to Africa because the Tsar's troops had posted wanted posters and rewards to kill them. So they went to South Africa, at that time Rhodesia and South Africa, and one of them remained, and the other one came to the United States. My father, who spoke fluent Yiddish and German, fought the Nazis in World War II. And was involved in liberating a concentration camp where he had some horrible experiences. He was seriously wounded toward the end of the war. As young women and men, they were both strong advocates for Zionism in Israel and fundraisers. They later soured on that completely, and grew to disdain what Israel had become and rejected in its totality Zionism. So I come from a very long, my mother, even at 85 years of age, would sit by the kitchen table and write letters to the president and to congressional representatives and to local mayors, complaining and arguing. So I come from a very long, natural family of fighters that were not cowed or intimidated by the specter of power, working class, poor family. And I have been adopted by the Bear Clan in Akwesasne. I have a Mohawk partner who have a very famous family in Akwesasne. We've been together 27 years. So on both sides, my natural family and my inherited family are very strong, determined, serious fighters who understand very well. This is a very short journey. Those of us that are gifted with both the skill set, the drive, and the opportunity to try to make an impact will and must do it. And that's what it's been about. So, will they come for me again? Perhaps. Maybe this time there are others that are more angry. I know Putin's very upset and Sisi's very upset. Israel obviously is, if I said I've been banned from Israel for 15 years, there's no doubt in my mind if I set foot in Israel, I would be arrested and charged with terrorism and a whole host of other actions. Saudi Arabia, where I used to travel fairly often, where I had a number of clients, I'm now banned. The same with UAE and Bahrain. For speech, for representing unpopular people, for confronting and challenging them verbally and publicly. I'm not going to change. This is who I am and who I've been for half a century. And my family before that for 150 years.
So it's in your blood, really. And you have this whole history, this lifelong history of standing up to power, standing up for unpopular truths, standing up against, you could say, mass deceptions or illusions that, many Americans hold. But there are a lot of people who aren't as, devoted as you. They're just kind of regular people living their lives, some of whom will end up getting fired for, let's say criticizing Israel. That still happens.
Mm-hmm.
Or, other things. And so those people, they don't have kind of the same history, the same background as you in terms of being the type of person who has always been able and willing to stand up at risk to, even at risk to yourself. But what do you think makes certain people able to do that? Whereas most people will just live in their comfortable lives, even if they see a truth and they want to name it, they'll censor themselves oftentimes.
Look, we all have our own skill set. We all have our own obligations. We all have our own families. We all have our own, priorities. It doesn't make those of us who step into the belly of the beast, better or more productive or, more principled. I was lucky at a very early age to meet, work with, get to know, love some truly incredibly gifted, powerful fighters, union organizers, lawyers, activists. I grew up in a time where the battle with the state was on a different level, a different sort of stage. Everyone can do their own little part. It could be something as small, but it's not inconsequential, as debating with their partner over good and bad. It could be something as consequential as carrying a placard at a demonstration. It could be something as quote unquote inconsequential as making sure the children that they're bringing up are reading or getting exposed to a diversity of thought, that have the freedom, the ability, the skill set, the opportunity to make decisions on where they want to go and why. We live in difficult times. We live in times where the state and the 1% and the powerful that further the state agenda feel under siege. We live in a time where propaganda and the ability to unleash propaganda is everywhere. We live in times where, unfortunately, partisan politics has taken the lead from couches, where there's different economic considerations or different health considerations. The earth is in a different situation than when I grew up and started. But I still have a lot of faith and a lot of hope that there are young women and men out there that are coming up that care, that are principled, that are concerned, and that are fighters. Now, it's funny. A number of years ago, ran into a colleague of mine in legal aid when I was down in Florida doing a so-called terrorism case, and I was at an airport, and I didn't recognize them. And they came up to me, and they had the white coat on and white pants and a big hat, and they said, "Stanley, how are you?" And I said, "Oh, hey, how are you?" And I said, "How you doing? You still practicing?" And they laughed. He said, "No, I retired 20 years ago and bought a chain of restaurants. Now I'm rich and old and I get sunburned easily." So they made a decision about how they wanted to go and where they wanted to go. They were good as a lawyer. I've also met people that I grew up with that I come across years later and say to me, "I see you're still fighting." And I say, "Yes." And I say, "What about you?" And they say, "I grew up." And my response has been, "You mean you gave up?" I don't have a problem with making a decision that this is not your fight. You don't want to do it any longer. You don't want to pay the price. That's fine. But to trivialize or minimize or recast the necessity to become friction unto the machine because it's less painful for you is childish. We live in a place and a time that has a very rich and storied tradition of individuals. Mass movements, yes, but also individuals who played essential roles in organizing and speaking and fighting. Some of them history doesn't remember. It really doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, I don't care what history recalls. I have to look in the mirror and say to myself, am I comfortable with what I did? Am I comfortable with the life that I've led? Clarence Darrow, who the great civil rights criminal defense attorney of the 19th century and the early 20th century, when asked on basically his deathbed, if you had it to do all over again, what would you do differently? And he jokingly said, "If I had it to do all over again, I wouldn't have done it at all." And then he laughed. I think everyone has to make decisions about what they want out of life and how they hope to get there. There are a lot of people that I feel are freedom fighters who have disabilities, who have limitations, whether they're economic, whether they're physical, whether they're skill sets, or for whatever reason, who are still part of this movement of growth and change and principled fighters. And we all have our different skill sets. So I don't, I get grief sometimes because I talk about people that are skilled, that can be organizers, that can be out there, that can be fighters, that can be developing relationships, feel they're part of this, quote, revolutionary movement, because on the basis of their writing alone or on the basis of podcasts. And, I say, well, I.F. Stone sort of said, fuck it. And yeah, he crossed the line on occasion. And I don't have a problem. I think the marketplace of ideas requires, before you can have change, there has to be a free, a vibrant, robust marketplace of ideas. And that doesn't mean that one voice is stronger than another, one voice is more powerful than another, one voice is more important than another. What it means is voices are essential. I've been blessed. I've been blessed with friends and family and opportunities that have empowered me with the problems and with the difficulties in my own small way to make a difference in the lives of individuals, in communities, both in the United States and overseas. And I'm fine. That's plenty for me. And unlike Darrow, I would do it all over again, and I would do nothing different. It's been a good journey.
Yeah. It's really interesting to hear you talk about how you had friends, or you have friends who kind of stopped going on that same path for their own reasons, which are valid, but then maybe as a result of that, they actually started to change the way they thought about the issues and maybe dampened their own previous beliefs and values, where because they had decided not to take that stand anymore. And that's really interesting to me, because I do wonder how many people do that in their daily lives, where they say, okay, I see this truth here that so many people are denying, but I don't want to risk, my livelihood, my reputation, my friends, whatever it is. And those reasons may be completely valid. I'm definitely not advocating people to go out and, get fired if they have kids to feed or anything like that. But what's strange about people is that I think then we also tend to start to shift our own beliefs. So then some people, because they don't feel comfortable speaking out about something, they'll say, well, maybe, it's not that important, or maybe I'm wrong. And they'll kind of weaken and dampen those beliefs. And then, like you said, the entire marketplace of ideas will suffer from their own sort of silencing themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the last years ago, I got offered a job teaching, running a criminal law clinic at Harvard Law School. And I told them, when you fire Dershowitz, give me a call. The specter of sitting in the same university with Alan Dershowitz, who, me, I'm a horrible human being. Why would I want to sit? I would prove to be a horrible human being if I agreed to work in a law school where Alan Dershowitz was. But over the years, I have mentored and sponsored, many law students from different law schools. In the last 3 seasons, I've agreed to serve as a mentor to Hayward Burns fellows from the National Lawyers Guild. These are young women and men. They're great. They're brilliant. They're shining stars. They're going to be great litigators, great attorneys. I'm a tough person to work for. And my view is we reach a point in our lives that, if nothing else, as long as we can inspire others that follow, as long as we can lead others to understand that there's a price to pay and it can be dear, as long as we can lead others to understand that it's not about, especially in criminal defense. I mean, I've had young lawyers or law students complain to me about those cases where I've represented clients that have cooperated with the state or federal government. And they said, well, didn't it offend your principles? I said, no, my principles are secondary to what's in the best interest of my client. If I can't represent someone because it offends my principles from jump, I won't represent them. But the notion that when I have a client who makes a decision that they wish to cooperate, whatever that may mean, absent a conflict of interest or absent some real core fundamental feed on my ability to continue with effective counsel, so be it. I mean, I don't get those in political cases, but that's in lots of, classic criminal cases. Well, you got to keep in mind, almost all criminal cases are political. You may not be an activist, you may not be a member of a movement, you may not be a so-called alleged foreign or domestic terrorist, but the criminal justice system still feeds entirely off of people of color, people of poverty, and people of fierce politics. Those are political cases. So yes, at the end of the day, 90% of everyone arrested in this country and prosecuted, it's a political case. It may be skin tone, it may be the empty of your pocket, it may be your voice on a street corner, they're political. But there's political, and then there's, representing Hamas for 20 years, representing the Mohawk Warrior Society for 30 years, representing representatives of Hezbollah on and off for years, or the IRA. It raises different implications. People get all fucked up when they say, how did you represent Osama bin Laden's son-in-law? Well, I have, I'm a criminal defense attorney. I represent political movements. I represent
people don't understand
alleged to be terrorists.
People tend to really dismiss the idea that we have in our Constitution that everyone should have a legal defense if they've been accused of a crime, and everyone deserves that right. And, the presumption of innocence, that really goes out the window.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not the ACLU, although they do very good work. I would not have represented the Nazis and Klan at Skokie, although that's a very important case that I've relied upon internationally, including in South Africa. I don't take classic political cases, classic political movements, unless there's one of two factors. I have to share some commonality with the politics of the person, the movement, or the case, and some ability to relate on a person-to-person level with my client. Handling cases that can take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. One case I did of a young man that took 13 years. A lot of time, a lot of energy. When I represented Abu Marzouk, the head of Hamas and one of the founders of the movement, we met in federal prison 3 to 4 nights a week, every week, for almost 2 years. We spent thousands of hours in discussions, 80% of which had nothing to do with his case. Had to do with world politics, had to do with reality on the ground, had to do with politics, had to do with Palestine, with Israel, with history. He's a political scientist. So I developed relationships. When I was preparing the Abu Ghraib defense, I had to meet frequently with men that had survived Gitmo. And I met with them in Kuwait. And we talked about lots of issues, international politics. When I was involved in the negotiations to try to save Abdurrahman Peter Kassig's life, when I was negotiating with ISIS using Al-Qaeda, a lot of it had to do with nitty-gritty, on-the-ground debate about politics, about life, about movements, about purpose, about reality. It wasn't simply, hi, my name is Stanley, what's your name, Muhammad? What do we have to do to end? It doesn't work that way in the Middle East and in North Africa. Islam, like indigenous communities, don't separate family, faith, community, politics, and purpose. They're 5 fingers and 1 fist. They're not nicely carved up and separated like they are in the rest of the world. And it's a line that has brought me comfort with both representing indigenous people throughout North America and in South America, as well as movements and people in the Middle East, because there is this centrality. You don't conveniently separate. Well, I'm gonna be a scavenger and make a ton of money and rip off people so that my kids can go to a good school. It doesn't work that way. What is my purpose? What is my aim? What is my role? How do I bring this all together? And that's been a cornerstone which has sort of fueled me in developing some very good and strong and solid relationships with individuals and movements that much in the Western world despise. I have many dear and close friends in the leadership of Hamas. Ahmed Yassin and I were very close. He was assassinated. Sheikh Ahmed. Abu Shinab and I were very close. He was assassinated. I could go down a list of founders and framers of Hamas that I have a very long and warm relationship with. These are brilliant men and women. These are educated men and women. These are people that have a purpose, that have a function, that are committed to their communities, their peoples, their families, and national liberation. Have we disagreed at times about things? Sure, it happens. Uh,
Are
but
there women in leadership in Hamas? I think because a lot of Americans would probably be really surprised to hear that.
no, there are women whose input, while you see male division because it's nice and cute and it sells politically to say Hamas is a matriarchal, hierarchical entity that doesn't take feedback from women, that isn't moved by women. Some of the prime people that I have represented on terrorism charges in Hamas were women, including one, it doesn't matter who was part of the prisoner exchange 10, 12 years ago, who had originally been convicted in Israel for participation in the Second Intifada and some bombings, and was released to another country. And then only years later, Trump, for political purposes, decided he wanted to extradite her. The women on the ground in Palestine don't need, and I know many, and many of them are dear friends. Many of them I've spent a lot of time with. They don't need to be identified with political movements. Okay? I have a dear friend of mine for many years who has said to me, I don't like Hamas. I hate the PA, but Hamas gives me and us dignity. So this notion that Hamas is this hierarchical structure, or that the Palestinian resistance is this hierarchical, matriarchal structure that denies women input, feed, participation, direction, participation in strategy and roles, leadership, is utter nonsense. It's part of the Western rewrite to say, well, this is why they're so bad. You can't be a leftist, you can't be a progressive and be opposed to various isms and at the same time support national liberation in Palestine, because look what they do to the LGBTQ community, and look what they do to women, and look what they do to people of color. It's all nonsense. So there's friction on the ground in all national resistance movements or national liberation movements. I know we've sort of walked away from this a bit, but that has to do to get back to the notion of, you asked me, what feeds my half century of work? And what feeds my half century of work has been these incredible relationships I've developed with women and men, the LGBT community, Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists, agnostics, people that believe in lighting candles and singing Kumbaya, other people who believe in armed struggle. I have met some fabulous people, a good number of whom have lost their lives, have lost their liberty, but to their dying day, their voice was never silenced.
Yeah, and you bring up some of the sort of identity politics, divisions that are being created, especially among the left these days. So, you mentioned people will say, oh, you can't support such and such because they're not pure enough when it comes to feminism, gay rights, LGBT, trans rights, all these things. And I have to ask, because you also brought up the ACLU, about, they've changed a bit, I would say. I am definitely a big fan of the ACLU that you described, representing, the case in Skokie, Illinois, which was a free speech case. And I've actually interviewed Nadine Strawson, who was the head of the ACLU for many years. And I asked her the same question I asked her specifically, why do you think the ACLU has changed and sort of adopted this, you could call it woke identity politics. But I'm also curious what you might say to that, and if you just generally feel that the left has changed at all in your time. Do you consider yourself a leftist, and do you think that it has changed and become woke and become fractured in these ways?
Well, the core of my principle is the same today as it was 50 years ago. I don't identify by anthems, oaths, romantic notions. Left people, today I got called a lib by someone who didn't like the position I was taking. And I said, well, good. When you've been banned 5 times and have been arrested 6 times, been in prison twice, and have represented who I'm representing, you call me a lib. I don't worry about labels. What is disappointing about the quote, not so much, some, especially some of the more vocal members of the self-professed left these days is the naive talisman of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That I have been in a very long, I was quiet largely. I've been to Syria many times. I have clients on, quote, both sides of the revolution. Some call it a revolution, some call it a civil war, whatever you want to call it. And I was largely quiet for most of the Civil War because it had an impact on a large part of my practice. I think Vladimir Putin and the FSB are monsters. I think they're war criminals. I have challenged them and beaten them in Interpol. I have represented victims of theirs in Georgia, in Chechnya, in Crimea, in Ukraine. This notion that because I abhor NATO and have for many, many, many years, I have to love Putin is trash. It's childish. It's infantile. I try to maintain a consistency in my politics, just the way I have challenged the United States over starving to death 500,000 children during the first reigns of embargoes, of sanctions. I'm not going to be quiet and haven't been when it comes to Putin for 20 years for what he's done to his own people in Russia, for the political prisons, for the torture, for the outrageous sentences, for the executions, for the attacks on journalism, and for his adventurism. Now, of course, there's the Wagner Group that's protecting, or at least was protecting, the natural resources of Russia, of Africa, which somehow ended up slipping away from Africa and poor African communities and states and ending up in other parts of the world. So I get a lot of grief over that because people necessarily take the position because I am very vocal in opposition to Putin and long before his invasion of Ukraine, and because I have fought the FSB, which could have easily been running Gitmo, same tactics, same attitudes, even more abusive, for many, many years, that somehow I'm pro-NATO or I'm pro the United States. And Putin and the FSB are revolutionary figures that are going to liberate the world and are all about, a continuation of Trotsky and of Lenin. Absolute rubbish. So yes, there is a part of the left today. I recall, it doesn't matter who, a very prominent journalist, a leftist, who comes from a very wealthy and mainstream political family in the United States, well-suited, going from Assad as a war criminal to dinner at Moscow to Assad is a freedom fighter. I grew up in an age where you challenged the government. It didn't matter which government it was. It didn't matter which state it was. It didn't matter which quote-unquote deep state it was. If your principles said they're wrong, they need to be opposed, they need to be fought, they need to be challenged, you do it. And the enemy of my enemy is not my friend. It's that simple. If you apply and I've tried to, a personal standard of principle of priorities, of struggle, of resistance and work across the board, it leaves you to some degree a stateless person no matter what passport you carry. And that's why essentially now I'm banned by 5 or 6 countries, and I've had to some degree. I can't go to Russia. It's funny, I was accepted by Patrice Lumumba University when I was an undergraduate, and regretted not going, but something came up and didn't. I did a terrorism case in Romania, and had plans to go to Russia to visit some friends, and they were actually people who were subsequently arrested and prosecuted under Putin and disappeared. The notion that the Russia of Vladimir Putin is a communist state is like mixing meth with LSD and rolling it in pot. I mean, it's crazy. But it gives people comfort to say NATO sucks. Yes, NATO sucks. Yes, European colonial projects are the enemy. Yes, a pox on all their fucking houses. But the reality of it is I have always stood with countries that have been invaded and countries that have been occupied. Are there Nazis in Ukraine? Sure. Are there Nazis in the United States or neo-Nazis? Sure. In Israel? Oh, yeah. All over the world. But there are 40 million people whose country has been invaded and is occupied, and I'm going to stand with them. With all the warts, with all the jewelry that Zelensky's wife may be acquiring in the latest scandal. So you're either with an occupation or you're opposed to it. And that's been the core of my life. It's something that I grew out of when I was 16 years of age. The first time I crossed the Brooklyn Bridge in an anti-war demonstration, and a cop bloodied my nose with a nightstick. And it hasn't changed. It stayed with me when I was a Vista volunteer. And when Vista called me on the carpet, claimed that they had heard rumors, had evidence, and they never proved it, that I was driving my car to Wounded Knee with weapons in the car. It's like, really? You got photos? You got, let me hear, let me see. And, you follow the pattern of my life, and there have been these accusations. And so now members of the left have, called me a lib and have called me, I've surrendered. Meanwhile, I spend half my life still talking with, dealing with, and representing on one level or another national liberation movements across the globe that are still involved in armed struggle. So I'm a lib.
Yeah, well, some people just can't have consistency in their principles enough to, for example, be critical of NATO and also be critical of Putin. So, there are some people who, because they see the what the U.S. has done and what NATO has done to bring about the situation, they just cannot bring themselves to then talk about what Russia has done as well. So there are a lot of people who are just too black and white like that.
I mean, my grandfather fought the fucking Tsar. We come from Russia. We come from Lithuania. We come from Latvia. No one has to lecture me about pogroms, about what triggered the revolution, about why the revolution was so great, and why and how Stalin lost his fucking life lost his mind late in his life. It is what it is. If you want to talk about the genocide of indigenous communities, absolutely. It's funny. People are completely fucked up right now over that stupidity in Canada, where the parliament gave a standing ovation to a Nazi, a 98-year-old Nazi. I'm not even sure if most of parliament knew who the fuck he was. Meanwhile, the residential school system has just had some money thrown at it and said, go away, Indians. And meanwhile, thousands of indigenous women disappeared, raped and murdered every year in Canada, certainly hundreds, but it's gone into thousands now. And I don't see a like outrage. I'm less concerned about what's going on with a 98-year-old fucking ex-Nazi than I am what's going on with First Nation women and children that are being pillaged and plundered and denied the sovereignty that they are denied by virtue of the John Jay Treaty. So I don't want to hear about some 98-year-old fucking Nazi, yeah? Let's talk about Nazis all over the fucking world right now. Neo-Nazis and nationalism. What are we dealing with here? But no. You see, it's all connected. A plus B equals L equals 1 times 3 is 9. So good. Go on. What do you want me to do?
Stanley, we've reached the end of our hour, and it has been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much, and we'll leave it at that unless you want to add any last words.
Up the rebels.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Stanley.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure, and my solidarity with your audience, and stay strong.